Good evening and welcome to the Autumn 2021 Open Lectures brought to you by the University of York. My name's Reyahn King. I'm Chief Executive of York Museums Trust. My first job in museums was at the National Portrait Gallery Archive. And whilst there, I noticed that the portraits seemed to have a monocultural appearance. And I started to try to find portraits that represented other kinds of stories. Ultimately, that search led to the first biographical exhibition about a Black person at the National Portrait Gallery on Ignatius Sancho in the 18th century. But that exhibition was in 1997, and yet the long-lasting and deep influence of people of colour in this country continues to be countered or ignored or overlooked as if it were not historical fact. The speakers tonight have moved the dial on this subject. But before I introduce them, a few technical notes. Hopefully no issues. Should you have any issues, such as losing Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. If you're watching live, you'll be able to ask questions of our speakers using the Q&A box. I will take as many of those as I can at the end. Live captioning is available, and if you would like to switch it on or off, you can do so via the closed caption or live transcript button on your screen. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again and share with your friends via YouTube. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our three guests for this evening. Each of our speakers will start by giving us a brief overview of their interest and their subject. Then we will have a short discussion before opening up to your questions. Fatima Manji is an award-winning broadcaster and author. She's also very well known to many of us and admired as Channel 4 news anchor, where she reports on major national and international stories and breaking stories with a global impact. In her book, Hidden Heritage, Rediscovering Britain's Lost Love of the Orient, she searches for a richer and more honest story of our nation as it struggles with identity and the legacy of empire. It is a wry and accessible account of her research journey through some key cultural landmarks. In it, Fatima highlights objects and buildings, sometimes looted, sometimes lost, often overlooked. And they reveal deep threads of connection to what Fatima has reclaimed as the Orient. Professor Corinne Fowler is a research expert at the University of Leicester. She co-authored the National Trust report on its historic houses, links to colonialism. Corrine specialises in the legacies of colonialism and post-colonialism to literature, heritage and representation of British history. In her most recent book, Green Unpleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural England's Colonial Connections, Corrine dissects how writers and their audiences have together created a sort of fantasy about our countryside, frequently and artificially divorced from the global roots of the wealth and culture celebrated in our country houses and our literature. Dr. Nima Poovaya-Smith, OBE, is an art historian, curator and writer, and much admired in the museum sector for her groundbreaking work making museums more relevant to more audiences. She was the founding director of Alchemy, head of special projects at the National Media Museum Bradford, and senior curator of Bradford Galleries and Museums. She developed the Transcultural Gallery and the Connect Galleries for Cartwright Hall in Bradford. She is a senior visiting research fellow at the School of Fine Arts, History of Art and Cultural Studies at the University of Leeds. I will be back after Fatima, Corinne and Nima have talked to take some questions from the audience and to have a discussion with them. So please do add your questions to the Q&A box as we progress. Now, Fatima, it is my great pleasure to welcome you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you particularly for that kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here on this really distinguished panel, and I'm thrilled to be here and particularly do another event with York. I did the last one about news, it was fantastic, and so I'm hoping we'll get some great audience questions again today. So just a little bit of background about hidden heritage and how I ended up writing this book. Back in 2016, which now feels like a long time ago given world events, but 2016 at the time felt like a big year politically, and it was pretty busy news-wise. And so as a way to escape, I started going to smaller museums and galleries and stately homes a lot more, just to look at art initially. And I thought, well, this will be a way to escape politics. It didn't quite turn out that way, because every now and then I'd see something interesting. So I'd see a portrait of someone with darker skin or dressed in traditional Eastern dress, or I might see a swirl of an Arabic or an Urdu letter. And then I'd start to ask, who is that person? What is that object? How did it get here? And I'd ask people in the galleries and museums these questions, and quite often the answers weren't forthcoming. And so I began visiting more of these heritage sites and carrying out some research, because I found those objects fascinating. And when I told friends and family, they found those objects and places fascinating. And I thought, here is a hidden history, and here is one that needs to be told, not just because they're nice stories that everyone likes to hear about, but because I think that these places serve as the gatekeepers of our national memory. And what happens today politically is very much determined by what we believe happened historically. And so that's why I ended up writing Hidden Heritage, because I wanted to share those stories, but also reflect on what some of these stories might have to say to us today. So Hidden Heritage starts with Elizabethan England, Tudor England, and Elizabeth I's interactions with the Moroccan kingdoms and the Ottoman empires. And by the way, I felt that this was not something that I had learnt in all the incessant stories about Tudors that we hear in schools. I'd never learned about the interactions that Elizabeth I had with the Orient. And it was a real pleasure to sort of look at sort of gold-dusted, speckled letters that she exchanged with the Sultan and Sultana of the Ottoman Empire that remain in the British Library today. And Hidden Heritage ends at the First World War with stories of Indian soldiers or soldiers from the Indian subcontinent, particularly on the south coast, coming as the war wounded during the First World War, and particularly at Brighton Pavilion, which was turned into a hospital at the time. It's not a comprehensive history, so it begins with Tudor England, ends at the First World War. It's not comprehensive, it's just a selection of stories and objects and places that I found interesting and I wanted to share with you, and I hope you will find interesting too. So among the stories I tell is that of the first mosque structure being constructed in Britain, and that was back in 1762 at Kew Gardens, which people find very surprising, and it's a nice fact to share with people. It was a Turkish-style mosque structure and commissioned by a Georgian princess. I also tell the story of the treasure trove of objects belonging to Tipu Sultan, who was a South Indian king, a foe of the East India Company, ousted from the throne, and many of his objects made their way back to Britain and remain in heritage sites today. So I sort of trace their journey and tell the story of how they came to Britain. And for me, all of this is about acknowledging the facts of history. It's not about flagellating or celebrating. It's about saying, these are the facts of history and we can acknowledge them. Because I think that Britain still suffers from historical amnesia. I think that there is a conception or an idea that people of colour only came here on the Empire Windrush, Caribbean migrants, and then South Indians, South Asians followed them in the 50s and 60s. And yes, that's one version of history, which is correct, but it's only one version of history. And I think that there are many other hidden stories that we're missing if we imagine that to be the only story that we should tell. And along the way, I found some things that were a little bit disturbing, not just historically, but in terms of practices that were going on in some museums and galleries. So for instance, in one gallery, which I won't name, I heard a guide telling a group of visitors that the English were in India because the Indians invited them in to help them. which was an interesting telling of the British Empire in India. But at the same time, I think there's some excellent work now going on, and some museums and organizations are working very hard to try and tell alternative stories, because I think they realize that not only is there a moral argument to be made, but there is also a commercial argument to be made, that there are lots of people who would like to visit these sites and may visit these sites if they think that there's something there for them. And so I think that those, aside from the moral, there is also a commercial case to be made as to why our heritage sites should be more inclusive. And I will just, I don't want to get into the politics too quickly, I'm sure we will in the discussion, but I will just say this. We hear the term woke being used as a term of insult against those who wish to tell or acknowledge the facts of history. I've often recently been left wondering about one particular story that I tell in Hidden Heritage, which is that of Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria had a very close friend and courtier called Corrine, who came from the Indian subcontinent. He became her confidant, he became her Urdu tutor. She would learn to write Urdu, and she wrote diaries in Urdu, and she wrote letters to him in Urdu, which caused a lot of jealousy among other courtiers in the royal household. And it ended up in a situation where Queen Victoria accused other members of her royal household of being racist against Corrine. And I often wonder today that whether Queen Victoria acting in the way that she did would be considered woke. And so that's something to perhaps ponder about when we think about how we view history and what we imagine to be the truth, and what really are hidden layers underneath those histories. So thanks very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion and love to hear your questions and share a bit more of Hidden Heritage with you. And I'm going to hand over to Nima now.
Thank you very much, Fatima. That was absolutely fascinating. I've just got 2 points about Hidden Heritage. My first point is that heritage, particularly literary heritage, is a portable construct. I would contend, for instance, that the acclaimed Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz is as much part of the literary heritage of England as are the Bronte sisters. This is because he occupies so much of the emotional and imaginative landscapes of so many of the South Asian communities living here. For those of you who don't know, who was Faiz Ahmad Faiz? He was a poet, journalist, polemicist, and educationist. He was also a prisoner and exile, winner of the Lenin Peace Prize and a Nobel Prize nominee. He's one of the very few artists who can lay claim that the heads of both India and Pakistan pleaded with him to choose their respective countries after the 1947 partition. He chose his birthplace of Pakistan. Already famous, it was his writing post 47 that gave him international stature. Faiz's poems and letters powerfully articulate his relentless opposition to the series of military dictatorships that were draining Pakistan of its lifeblood. His refusal to be partisan about Pakistan's conflicts meant self-imposed exile when General Zia seized control. However, he also returned. Faiz's words reverberated with the public because they knew this was not empty rhetoric. He had suffered, had been traduced in the press, and had been imprisoned with a charge that carried a possible death sentence. In the poem Dedication, he names the people to whom it is dedicated: office workers, postmen, tonga drivers, railwaymen, mill workers, farmers, the poor widows and brides, prisoners, and scholars. 2011 was the centenary of Faiz's birth. He died in 1984. Alchemy, of which I was director, in partnership with Faiz's daughter, Salima Hashmi, an acclaimed artist and curator in her own right, presented a program of Faiz's poetry and letters. Hosted by Harewood House, Opera North, and the National Media Museum, Salima's wonderful readings and commentary painted a vivid picture of a truly remarkable international poetic voice. The audience of different cultural backgrounds was electrified. The poetry clearly resonated. The urgency of his continuing importance to the 21st century cannot be overstated. Why would we not want to have this titan as part of the literary heritage of this country. My second point is that a considerable amount of heritage is hidden in plain sight, possibly because we're not looking all that hard for it. I had always wondered if Bradford had had textile links with the Indian subcontinent before the arrival of the South Asian community, around about the 50s. That's when the main wave started. Reading Brenda M. King's book, published in 2005, Silk and Empire, one paragraph leapt out at me and my heart leapt with it. The role of, I quote, the role of Indian textile design in Bradford at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was a highly influential one. All of the essential aesthetics and technical principles referred to by educators of designers and weavers were displayed in India's textile designs. Furthermore, in Indian textiles, they were combined with the requirements of utility and expressed an exceptional command of coloring. It was this unique combination that made them the most suitable exemplars for hand or machine production. It is obvious why Indian designs are so strongly represented in the archival material of Bradford, key textbooks, students' work, trade journals, products of the textile industries, and the fashion journals. My own readings of the writings of the principal benefactor of Cartwright Hall Art Gallery, this is Bradford's principal museum, textile grandee Samuel Cunliffe Lister, 1815 to 1906, unearthed the fact that he had owned silk farms in India. These discoveries did not involve any primary research on my part, but provided the narrative framework for the exhibition, Silk, Bradford and the Subcontinent, which I curated. Lister had helped revolutionize the wool industry with his inventions. Now his silk comb appliances enabled the large-scale use of waste silk. He recouped his investment tenfold. Lister took what had until then been seen largely as a worthless product, waste silk, and made it into a material desired wherever fine dress goods were bought. Bradford silks were commissioned by illustrious clients such as Queen Mary, and the source of this waste silk was India. Presciently, Lister had said that he pictured Cartwright Hall as the place where the Asiatic of the future might come in search of the inventor of the power loom. I have the very strong impression that the East will overcome the West in the coming years, and that instead of our clothing the East, they will want to clothe us, unquote. Bradford College was sponsored in 1878 by local industrialists, including Lister. It was set up because commercial supremacy came from technical education. The city owned almost complete sets of John Forbes Watson's magnificent collection of specimens and illustrations of the textile manufactures of India, brought out in 1866. Containing a comprehensive selection of Indian fabric samples, it is one of the most important cultural source books on Indian textiles. Forbes Watson's motives had a steely commercial underpinning. These mobile industrial museums worked as templates for manufacturers wishing to compete with the Indian market. Brenda King stresses how important these were in establishing a pedagogical base for textile students. I quote, all of the classes of woven fabrics that were discussed, including plain and twilled weave, satins, double cloths, brocades, gauze cloths, and velvets, had an Indian equal in the Forbes Watson collection to which students could refer, unquote. The emergence of a substantial South Asian community in Bradford, starting largely in the 1950s and working as industrious and productive textile mill workers, takes on a different kind of continuity in the light of this little discussed history. In conclusion, uncovering hidden heritage comes with side benefits. The Silk exhibition allowed more nuanced facts about Bradford's mainstream silk history to emerge, thanks to expert input from Peter Townhill, an industry insider. It allows us to highlight individuals who made exemplary contributions. Thomas Waddell, 1831 to 1909, a silk dyer, learned how to dissolve gum that coated wild Indian silk tussar fibers. It had not been used commercially because of the resistance to bleaching and dyeing. Now, Indian colorists dyed tussar with local plants and minerals, increasing the value of the yarn, and Waddell barely recovered his expenses. Regardless of cultural background, excavating truth is a deeply rewarding process, as Brenda M. King demonstrates. It paints a richer and truer picture. Hidden heritage is ultimately still British heritage. Thank you very much. And can I now invite Corinne to come on, take over.
Thank you, that was brilliant. I was, as mentioned earlier on, one of the co-authors of the National Trust report on its houses' connections to the British Empire. And that report was really in response to very recent pioneering historical research, which showed the global nature of British country houses. And with a few notable exceptions, that very relevant history had pretty much been overlooked by curators. For example, Basildon Park is a house, and the whole estate, in fact, was bought with, and the house was built with East India Company profits, but it was only mentioned in passing as if it wasn't really that relevant. It's important to say as well that the report is not just about slavery, whatever the journalists say, but neither is it just about colonial wealth and where the money came from. So you've got places like Durham Park, which is a story of colonial administration from within Britain itself. And then there are other places like Charlcote Park or Buckland Abbey, which provide really important information about the early African presence in the British countryside. And the thing about these histories is that they are not easily divided into two columns. So we're talking about, if you follow the history of country houses, we're talking about really intertwined histories. And there are all kinds of figures. One example I'll give you, who show what I mean by entwined histories. So wildly different types of colonial activity within a single life. And a great example that I came across a while back is Archibald Campbell. And he managed to be civil governor of Georgia, chief engineer of Bengal, governor of Jamaica, governor of Madras, and an MP, all within his just one lifetime. And obviously, the thing about this work on country houses is that it contradicts maybe conventional ideas of what a country house is and what it stands for. Madge Dresser and Andrew Han have called the country house the jewel in the heritage crown. And of course, country houses are very much associated with the rural idyll, and that's partly because of centuries of poetry about Arcadia and so on. But the rural idyll in the country houses was a pretty self-knowing artifice at the time, and there's been lots of work done on the way in which those estates kind of obscure the working people's labour that sustain them, but also more recently work on how that rural idyll sort of convert colonial fortunes into something else which appears to have nothing to do with empire. As we'll also all be well aware, there was very much a post-war decline of country houses, but then there were things like the National Trust Act and a lot of heritage dramas, particularly in the 1980s, that really revived this vision of the country house. And today, of course, they are very much places where people come to relax, as was said earlier, and walk their dogs or whatever, have a cream tea or whatever. And there was, of course, again, a backlash to the National Trust report. It caused a lot of political alarm, and government ministers did wade in very quickly to condemn the report, sometimes in very strong terms, sometimes in slightly milder terms. And after that, there was a coordinated smear campaign involving journalists, prominent columnists and certain newspapers. And there are hundreds of hostile articles about the National Trust report and about the people who'd written it, and me in particular being the academic author of the report. But I think this was really because there is a genuine threat presented by that kind of report to the status quo, and it is a genuine threat. I've looked a lot into public objections to talking about this kind of history, and one of the objections is often known in the heritage sector amongst historians as whataboutery. You know, what about the way in which people were treated in factories during the Industrial Revolution and so on, as if you have to talk either about one thing or the other. Another objection is, oh, the past is the past, we should leave it alone. But it's clear for all to see that there's an inconsistent repression of colonial history versus World War history, which we're all happy to talk about all of the time. And then another charge laid at the National Trust door, of course, was that it was politicizing heritage, but all it was doing was providing a fuller evidence-based history of those houses. And when it comes to the causes of these sorts of objections, I think first and foremost, as already mentioned, is an education system's failure. And there are a lot of misnomers, for example, about abolition. And a lot of this history feels very unfamiliar to people, and that encourages a sort of paranoia that people are somehow making it up or rewriting history. And the other problem we've got is seeing history through the lens of guilt and shame. And once you have looked more into this history, it does require a bit of a change in your worldview, as already mentioned. So that is quite hard work for people and quite difficult for people sometimes. Just finally moving on to my response, for me, I found that understanding these objections is more effective than judging them, because it allows us to reach more people and to reason and to make the case for doing this work. And increasingly, I've become interested in showing how entangled colonial history is with the history of working people in this country, for example. And I'm increasingly looking at the wider countryside beyond elite country houses. So looking at ports and woolworking and weavers, as many historians are. I think it's also important to have conversations, which is something else that I'm trying to do rather than debates, with people who have ancestral connections to empire, to humanise that history and to understand what it actually means to people, this shared history. So just to finish off then, we're operating in quite a tough environment at the moment, but I do believe that history will show us that the whole ship is already turning. Obviously, more knowledge is always a good thing, and our job is really to research that history some more, to provide a really strong evidence base, to resource people, to assist teachers, resource the museum sector, resource the heritage sector. Also important is to humanise history through the arts and so on, and ultimately to continue the work no matter what. I'll pass back to Reyahn.
Thank you, Corinne, Nima, Fatima, absolutely fantastic, succinct talks about this subject. Nima, I absolutely loved what you said about why would we not want to have this Titan phaser as part of our full national heritage. And Fatima, the idea of Queen Victoria, I just love the idea of politicians being confronted by the Queen accusing her household of being racist in the context of a woke agenda. I really like that bit of time travel that you brought in there. And I think why that's so relevant is that we have all in a way been talking about that's the fact that so much of this heritage is actually hidden, sometimes lost, but very often it's actually not that hidden. It's right there in plain view. And Fatima, in your book, you talk about all these beautiful jewel-like things from Tipu Sultan's palace that are right there and that are not being talked about. So, you know, I think that's really interesting. And yet, something that we've all encountered is that when we try and tell these stories, there's a kind of, at best, sometimes a kind of an overlooking or a dismissal, and at worst, Corrine, as you've suffered, a real backlash. And this phrase, contested histories, starts to crop up. So I'd love to hear a bit more about how we frame that discussion. And Corrine, you've given us some really great pointers there in terms of it is a conversation, and Nima talking about, and Fatima, we're all talking really about enriching all of our cultural heritage, everybody's cultural heritage in this country, because these stories are so fascinating. But I'm really interested in some of the terminology stuff as well about contested histories. Is that a phrase we want to accept?
It's a literal description, I suppose, in the fact that people do contest it sometimes, but it is unhelpful. I think, you know, it raises the ante in a way that doesn't always allow for what I think is civilized discourse. When it creeps in, then it,
yeah, I think it's a bit like, you know, the way that climate, there was a period when people felt that they had to bring in someone who didn't believe in climate change into the question. Yeah. And now I feel that that's sort of what we're being faced with some of these accusations of wokery. You know, actually, as you said, Corinne, you know, this is about fact. We had a big backlash recently when we told the story of our North African, very rich Roman woman who lived here in York. That's a fact. The University of Leicester's done, you know, scientific research that has found that out, and yet people really don't want to believe it.
No, that's right. And I would actually go so far as to say contested history is a harmful phrase, because it implies that people might be making it up, when in fact we need to be clear about where we've got an evidence base. So, of course, evidence is always open to interpretation, but it's really important not to imply that people are just rewriting history, as I said. And I would strongly advise any heritage organisations or museums to talk about this area of British colonial history as contested history for that reason.
Yes, I think if Fatima, what is your view? But I think we might be wanting to say in this panel, let's not accept that phrase anymore.
Yeah, and I think what Corinne said about involving the idea of ordinary working people's histories is really important, because, okay, yes, some of these stories are going to be uncomfortable, but why should you today find it uncomfortable to accept the fact that there are looted objects from the British Empire in National Trust properties and English heritage properties and so on? Why should you personally be uncomfortable by that if you're not to blame? I think we can make a distinction between saying, here are the facts of history, and yes, you should be uncomfortable by some of the things that happened under the British Empire, but it's not about anyone personally flagellating. And I think once we draw that distinction, it's a little bit easier to bring people who may be a bit skeptical along the way, along that journey. I think it's quite important to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's why your book is so important, Fatima, because you're showing how fascinating and compelling these histories are and how unique and varied they are. And that's why country houses also tell that incredibly varied history. And it's a wonderful education in those 400 years of British colonial engagement, even though some of that history is traumatic. It's also draws you in, and once you start looking at it, you can't stop, can you?
You really can't stop. I mean, I can't, my friends get very annoyed because I go into galleries automatically looking for things now, and they just say, do you just seek out the brown person in the painting? And I say, yes, I do. I do actually, and I'm not ashamed of it, because I think those stories need to be told.
Absolutely.
What I found also was that quite a lot of these things were in the public domain, but they were like thin threads. You know, they were not a whole fabric or a whole tapestry, and it's having to connect the dots. And that also made me think that perhaps, you know, we need much more multidisciplinarity in our approach to history, because I think that would make it even richer when we get, different kinds of expertise. I mean, it's what I'm saying is nothing new. It has been done, but it's something I think we need more of, particularly in this area.
I think the connections are fascinating, aren't they? When you see one person pop up somewhere and then they suddenly appear in a completely different context, and you think, is that really the same person? Oh my God, yes, it is, because actually elite history can be incredibly interconnected.
Yes,
so
a
true.
sense of deja vu. Yes.
And the other thing that struck me recently is how much appetite there is for archival research. Loads of people. You could have millions of lay researchers all desperate to get into the archives because people have realised how interesting they are, partly thanks to people like David Olusoga. They're all keen to get in there. I went to put out a call on Twitter, just one single tweet, just to gauge how much interest there was in a sort of public history project, who wants to be a volunteer researcher with training and stuff. And I got 200 odd people in 10 days, and I had to put out another tweet to say, please stop, because I couldn't cope with the level of, it was all the emails.
That's a good problem to have, though.
Very nice problem.
There's a question here about funders, which I'll come back to, George, but it reminds me in the context, Corinne, of what you're talking about, that there was a fantastic project in Birmingham funded by Heritage Lottery Fund called My Route, and it took the route of a bus and it went through all of the different stages over time that this bus route had covered, from Irish immigration through to South Asian immigration, and how people had moved their lives along this bus route, where you sort of, it's in a city at the beginning of the bus route and then sort of comfortable suburbs by the end, and people tended to kind of move along that line. It's a really interesting project, but what was great about it was they got people together on a bus, and it was beautiful to see, because people would join because they wanted to know about their own bit of heritage, the Irish bit or the South Asian bit or whatever. And then they would talk to each other about the different heritages, and they would all be enriched by learning about those different things in Birmingham. So, I think this is really possible to do and really mutually interesting. It's just, and there's a question from my friend Rosie Duskier there, asking about how can we move this forward generally. And I think you've all presented quite kind of compassionate views. I want to invite you also to talk, Corinne, in a minute about what you've done commissioning Black and Asian writers to talk about the subject, because that links back with what Nima was saying too, about how different multidisciplinary approaches to this can perhaps unlock things.
Yes, shall I start with that? Do you want me to?
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, for my colonial countryside project, it was a child-led history and writing project, sort of guided by a team of historians. We commissioned 10 writers of colour to each take one National Trust house and produce a research-based creative response to the history of that house. And it's been a really important exercise in, again, humanising that history, showing what it means, thinking about the gaps in the archives, just having a sort of compassionate imagination for the people on the often traumatic side of that history. And so it really brings that history to life. Also, I mean, the history can sometimes be a bit dry and convoluted. You don't want to, like Fatima said, you don't want to bore people by going into all the ins and outs of it. So creative writing is a really brilliant way of helping people imagine the human dimension to that history, and it works really well, I think.
Yes. Anyone would like to add to that on how to?
Well, just to say that I'm
talking about. Sorry, Fatima.
Oh, no, Nima, you go ahead.
No, we're talking about Osborne House in your book, and there were two other blue-blooded royals, in inverted commas, that Queen Victoria had taken under her wing. One was, of course, Maharaja Dilip Singh, and the other was a much lesser-known princess called Victoria Gaurama, who happened to come from the kingdom I come from. She was princess of that kingdom, though she'd never been there. And she commissioned Winter Halter to paint the portraits of these two blue-blooded royals. And she'd also thought that if she could somehow, because they had converted for reasons of expediency, I won't go into, they both converted to Christianity. She thought if she could get them married, then the other blue bloods in India would follow, and then India would become a Christian nation. And we then did a number of projects on Victoria Gaurama, the much lesser known princess. And it was dance, spoken word. A book had come out about her in India called Victoria Gaurama, the Lost Princess. And suddenly the whole thing took on a totally different kind of life. And it's almost like she stepped out of the margins, you know, from the shadows, and we could hear her voice again. So if anyone's interested, I can send you the link to the wonderful songs that, you know, Christella Littress and Rob Green sang about Victoria Gaurama. So suddenly someone who died at the tender age of 23 was literally the lost princess of Coog, came alive, I think, because we've taken a multidisciplinary approach to that particular, you know, we'd use different art forms in terms of the multidisciplinarity.
I also just want to pick up and quote back to you something that you said, Fatima, in your book. You say, by choice and by bondage, we made these islands too. I found that really powerful. And the implication is that we have in England, or many people in England have got a full sense of how we've ended up with the country and culture that we have. I think it might be time to get onto the politics. Why does that matter now?
Well, I think it matters always, because our imaginations of history shape what we believe today about our country and our place in it. And for me, I have a constant frustration that you have this idea that there's a white majority Britain that is then inviting minorities to come and be included as and when is appropriate. And actually that's not the truth of how Britain was forged, both away from Britain's land itself, you know, in the confines of empire, but also later through immigration. And I think that one of the things that I wanted to make clear is that the country as it is wouldn't exist were it not for these previous connections. And what's been fascinating for me as I talk to people about the book is that almost every talk that I've done, I get a young person of colour coming up to me and saying, it's finding it fascinating that there is something of a history that was longer than what they imagined, and finding a really personal connection. And for some people, it's very visceral. You know, this is to talk about the racism that they've faced or their parents have faced, and feeling like they don't belong. And for me, it was really important to say, these aren't just nice stories. These aren't just objects that you can just go and look at. These are evidence that you belong here, and don't let anyone tell you differently. And I think that's so important to state, and for people to be able to speak confidently about British history, because it's their history too.
Yeah, really eloquently put. I think that sense of the pain of the idea that we don't belong here, when we know that actually people of colour have been in these lands for a long time. There's on that note, I'm just going to, it's quite a long comment, so I'm only going to mention some of it, but I think given that we've talked about conversation, I'm going to pick up a question by Bob, who points out that the rich Roman African woman I mentioned might have had slaves, and do we think concentrating on empire and in relation to colour issues actually hides the slavery of Romans, Vikings, etc. And then he concludes by saying slavery and colour discrimination has no colour bar. And I think my view on that is we're looking at all kinds of things in museums, and we try and cover as much as we can. But really, I want to hear what you all three would respond to Bob to make him feel more comfortable with the fact that we are talking about colour this evening.
Well, I'll start with just on the Romans and slavery and so on. The National Trust report does give a full essay on the human history of slavery, so it doesn't concentrate only on transatlantic slavery. However, if you look at the history of heritage sites, we're talking about history that is relevant to 18th century and 19th century houses and Tudor houses and so on. So that by far postdates the Roman period. So that's why we're talking about history that is centrally relevant. And then just to move on to that, I think it's important that to understand that this is a shared history. If I bring my own family into it, you know, my family were both slave owners, and they were in what's now Haiti. They were also East India Company captains, but also my son is related to formerly enslaved people. So all those histories come together in all of us. And it's important also to think about the fact that it's not just about who was here, it's about the way in which this place has been connected to the rest of the world. And the wealth of this place is connected to all wildly different kinds of colonial activity, but it could not be more relevant to our history. That's not just a short history of abolition, but 400 years, 4 centuries of colonial activity.
I don't have anything to add to it. It's very well put.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's all that needed to be said, really.
Thank you, Corinne. That was fantastic. Lydia has a very interesting idea. I think it's a hypothetical. If not, Lydia, put it in the chat and say that, you know, if you're going to do it. But she says, so let's say I own a big country house that was built on money from enslaving people. Now I want to move into a small house and do something wonderful with my big house. I thought perhaps I could put it in trust with the descendants of those enslaved people for 400 years and then go into trust for the public. Do you have any comments or better ideas? Excluding the National Trust, she adds.
I think that's quite a difficult one to answer. I'm not sure what the answer to that one is. It's maybe that's a reminder of how complex it can be to trace who the rightful owner might be in this situation. But I would certainly hope that at some point we can confidently say that there are national organizations that you could entrust these properties to, who would do a good job of telling their histories in the way that they should be told.
Indeed, indeed. I commend her idealism, though, but yes.
And I think also there might be a question about, you know, given that certainly, you know, representing museums, our business is about talking about the past, understanding it better, bringing out those connections. It's not necessarily about trying to kind of repair the past, because I don't know if you can actually. So I'm kind of interested in you know, in that whole question. And there are some things like repatriation where we know there may be things we can do to make the past, to make up for the past, but then Lydia's idea is a complex one, but thank you for the interesting idea.
Is it worth mentioning that Catherine Hall, the leader of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership, does talk about reparative history, and I think that we could at least start by acknowledging the history. You know, that would be a really nice and respectful beginning, wouldn't it?
It would. It would. And following on from Fatima's ideal question, Gillian Jones started off our questions by saying, any places you would recommend visiting if we want to see histories presented in new and interesting ways?
Harewood House.
Yeah, definitely. And also look at the digital interpretation for Harewood House when you get in, because that's one of the clearest and most open explanations that I've seen. But I'd recommend also Penrhyn Castle. We've got a colonial countryside exhibition there at the moment, and they've taken objects in the house and they've shown how they link to empire, and I'm really happy with what they've done there.
Any suggestions, Fatima?
Well, I was going to say I came across one of Corinne's commissioned works at Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire, where school children were reacting to a tiger skin and objects there, and I thought that particular aspect was very interesting, as a out of the mouth of babes, as they say.
And an exhibition that's forthcoming at Tate, Hogarth and Europe may prove interesting. Tate have taken an interesting approach to that exhibition, inviting commentary from a wide range of people. So I don't know exactly what they're going to say. It hasn't opened yet, but I recommend visiting that to see an example of a place trying to do it differently. I can't believe that we're already nearly at the end of our time. It's been a fantastic discussion. We didn't have long enough, but thank you, Corinne, Fatima and Nima. I'm sure many of our audience members will be keen to follow you online and to read your books. Signed copies of Fatima's book, Hidden Heritage, are available from Fox Lane Books. You'll find the link in the chat. And Corinne's book, I'm not sure if that's available, but in Fox Lane Books, but it is widely available. If you enjoyed this event, you may be interested in another talk tomorrow at 6:30 online by Professor Kahinda Andrews, Professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University. His talk's called The New Age of Empire, and we hope some of you can join us for that tomorrow. All of our speakers have at some point talked about the importance of the public as agents of change or not. So I can't resist signing off by quoting from your book, Fatima, and I hope you'll forgive me. You end Hidden Heritage with a call to arms. I hope that you won't mind if I read it. The secrets of Britain's heritage sites await you. This is not just about whiling away weekends in museums. It is about who governs the boundaries of our collective national imagination, our self-perception, and our idea of what Britain means.